Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us online today for Postcards from the Edge, Hill Stations of the Raj. Part of MAP's online series Deep Dive, this talk delves into India's colonial history using an unusual source, postcards. Led by author and researcher Omar Khan, this session focuses on colonial postcards from the hill stations of Darjeeling and Shimla in India and Muri in Pakistan between 1897 and 1947. Hill stations were centers of retreat and power for European colonists in India. Omar will examine the visual narratives surrounding these high-altitude outposts, focusing on both European and Indian photographers and studios who were part of the postcard culture. Although largely overlooked by scholars and historians, postcards offer a window into popular perceptions, snapshots shared like the Instagram of those times. Through today's talk, we will learn more about how people at the time represented themselves in an ever-changing landscape. Omar Khan is the author of Paper Jewels, Postcards from the Raj. He grew up in Vienna, Austria, and Islamabad, Pakistan. And he also founded Harappa.com in 1995 and has researched early photography and ephemera of the subcontinent for over 30 years. A growing portion of his large postcard collection focused on South Asia is available at paperjewels.org and on his Instagram handle. And I'd urge you all to please go have a look. It's a fascinating collection. I would also like to take a moment to thank Saurav and Preeti for supporting us with ISL interpretation for today's session. Before I hand it over to Omar, I'd request you all to please drop in any questions you may have for our speaker in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and Omar's detailed bio will be shared in the comment section shortly. And now I hand it over to Omar.
Thank you, Sneha. Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here. Let me just share my screen and get going. Great. So here we are to talk about postcards from the edge. And I think of hill stations as a place where the British tried to divorce themselves from the rest of India and rule from a very much higher elevation. And I want to sort of tell this story of the postcards in three major hill stations: Darjeeling, the first one; Shimla, which was the major one and the center of British power; and Murree, a rather obscure hill station that I happen to know extremely well. And I also want to give a little bit of a history of postcards and their story, because they really were the Instagram of their time. Literally, in a couple of years between 1895 and 1905, it was the first time the whole world saw itself in visual imagery, and postcards were the medium. And we literally went from a few million postcards being produced a year in the mid-1890s to billions of postcards produced each year in countries like France and Germany and England, and many in India as well. And that's how the world first got to see other parts of the globe. So let's start with Darjeeling. Darjeeling was the first hill station. It was set up around the 1830s. There were 65 hill stations in total in India, where the British tried to move to a higher elevation. And the heat and the dust of the plains were a little bit much for many people coming from Europe. And they went, as Dr. Dane says in his really excellent book on hill stations, they went to collect themselves and get away from the corroding, corrupting influence of Oriental civilization. But as I will show, hill stations were a kind of hybrid land. They were unstable places, and maybe the word hill station doesn't fit really well. This is probably the very first postcard of Darjeeling ever made. It was made by an Austrian photographer, Werner Rössler, who lived in Calcutta and would obviously go to Darjeeling. This was the hill station. The first postcard concept actually was made by an Austrian, and it was Central Europeans, German-speaking people, who produced the first postcards. The British were a little bit late to the game. This postcard is from 1897, maybe even 1896. It was printed in Austria, and it is known as a lithographic postcard. And these are actually the very first postcards, were some of the most beautiful postcards, because you put 3 or 4 images sort of speaking to each other. You created a little bit of a dialogue on a very tiny, this is like, 3 by 5, piece of paper, slightly hardened cardboard that you could send through the mail. So you created a little bit of an interaction between the images. And I would say, look at the rail station at the bottom. This was, I think, set up in 1881. And that train connection made traveling to Darjeeling much easier for people. And that was an important part of setting up these hill stations, was getting there, because until you had a train station, it could take days to get up there. And note the man on the right. We're going to come back to him in a moment. I just want to show you what a lithographic press would look like. And these are pictures from presses in Germany, although the man at the top left is a man called Fritz Schleicher, who actually set up the Ravi Varma press in Bombay, in Mumbai. It was set up in 1892 and actually started producing postcards in 1898. There was a German lithographer there who was an artist as well, called Paul Gerhardt, who started producing some of the first postcards of India that were actually printed in India. The wrestler card I just showed you was printed in Austria. But a lithographic postcard was printed on a press where for each color, you had a different stone, which had to be then pushed through the press, printed on a piece of paper, maybe in runs of 2,000. Maybe you had 6 postcards put on one sheet and then cut up. It was a very difficult job, and you had to actually be very skilled, and lithographers were part of an artistic skill and sort of network of people who went around. And postcards were very much a global medium. So you not only could send a postcard from one place to another very quickly, the art and craft, the publication, the lithographic, this machinery was, for example, imported in the mid-1890s by the Ravi Varma Press. So India got part of the game from the very beginning. And I just wanted to step through the 4 main types of postcards. So lithographs were the first and earliest postcards. Then you had colotypes, where people took photographs and printed them on glass and then put the glass pieces through a very similar kind of press. So it was not a big, heavy stone, and you sometimes had a lot of problems with storage space. Limestone had to be often brought from Germany and so forth. So it was a much more efficient and less expensive way to produce postcards. Then you had halftones, where you printed a postcard spraying ink through a screen of dots on a piece of paper. And that's what we use in newspapers and magazines today. It's still the common form of printing. And finally, you had the real photographic postcard, where you actually printed a photograph straight on a postcard back and then mailed it. And the whole idea of postcards was, it was a business. You wanted to bring costs down. You wanted to make them as available to as many people as possible. And we should also say that postcards, much like the internet today is built on protocols, was built on a bunch of standard agreements. There was a World Postal Treaty in 1893 that specified the size of these objects, the postage, the revenue sharing among different countries and empires at that time, a transportation network built on trains, ships, the Suez Canal, conventions. There were all sorts of other facilitating things that went on in the world that allowed this free flow of information, much like the internet today, although the protocols were mechanical and physical as opposed to digital. So these are some of the very first postcards of Darjeeling. At the bottom right is Mount Everest. This was again an Austrian photographer, Thomas Parr, who actually set up a studio in Darjeeling and was very good in making postcards. And again, you had, similar to the lithographic postcard on the top left, a number of images put into conversation with each other. The front was largely white, not only because it was expensive to print ink and use ink to sort of fill up the space, but because at that time, the conventional treaties were only that you could write a message on the front of the postcard, and the back was only for the address. And it was only by about 1905, 1906 that that really changed. So you'll see in the bottom postcard, someone has written the message right there in the front. And I love looking at these postcards that have messages on them, or you can see Mount Everest at the top. There's a postal mark across of it. So they all have their own patina and their own aura in the way they work. And the man on the left, which you saw in the very first postcard, he actually was a fellow called Sherap Gayatsu. He was a Buryat from Siberia who came down to Darjeeling and set up a large Buddhist monastery, and was actually a prominent figure, both as a as a Buddhist priest and also as a sort of intermediary between the British and the local people. This is a postcard. This is from an Austrian or German publisher in the early 1900s, CA and Company. I don't know any more than that, other than they produce very beautiful postcards. This was an artist signed postcard. F. Perlberg was the artist. And in those early days, you had many postcards where an artist would make a painting and then sign it, and then that would be turned into the postcard. But you can see the entire colonial enterprise sort of represented here. And one must not forget that the colonists were interested in conquering space, not only conquering India as a territory and defeating the different empires there, but then also putting their imprint on something like a hill station where they wanted to go. So you see the church in the background. In the front, you see a bunch of European women sort of talking and pointing to the scenery in front of them. You see a number of European buildings below them. You have a very European sense to them. And in a way, the British were trying to represent to themselves the Alpine, European, Himalayan, kind of landscape in a Himalayan setting. And for them, for the British, the hills were clean and healthy versus the plains and dangerous disease and so forth of the rest of the lower elevations, because you're talking about 8, 6, 7, 9,000 feet up here. And of course, the mortality among the British was extremely high, especially in Calcutta, sometimes 20, 30, 40% of the people would die within a decade of getting there. So it was a place where they felt it was much healthier for them to go to. They were also very fascinated by the people that they would come up and meet in these sort of hill areas. And I think the people represented to them something like freedom from servility, simpler corporeal embodiment of an Edenic innocence, which is the way Dane puts it. And he continues to say that they saw the people at a place like Darjeeling as a moral antiseptic to the intractable and unfathomable subjects who occupied the plains. So I sort of showed these two postcards of a woman, a Tibetan woman, as she was named by the author. And I think this is a Thomas Parr photograph. But you can see the quick slip into fantasy, because on the left you have a more accurate representation, of the person from the photograph. That's a color-type. On the right, you have a halftone. Things are colorized, and you start getting more into a sort of different kind of realm. And postcards were part of this representation of the hill station as a different kind of place. And it's also an indication of the long lifetime of these images. Many of these images may have been made in the very 1860s, 1870s, but then they were reused as postcards in the early 1900s. And these images are both from about 1905. The other thing that I think postcards do is they also tell the underside story, the hidden story of hill stations. And one was that there was an incredible amount of labor involved in bringing the British to the hill stations and then building them. And you look at the woman on the left carrying a very heavy piece of lumber. There are kids on the right who are carrying up the suitcases. When the British went up to a hill station, even with the railway system, there was a tremendous amount of transportation required, labor required, thousands of people. And when the Viceroy would go to Shimla, for example, there were trains of thousands of people who were involved in carrying up all the goods there. And they used sometimes the Bigar system, where people were forced to work for the British and paid a very small amount and had to provide their services. So there was a tremendous amount of labor involved in sort of serving the British who were up there. And food had to be brought up and so many other things. The other great thing, or let's say special thing about Darjeeling, of course, was the fact that it was a site of great tea plantations. And this early house, this is another image from about 1903 or 1904, a lot of white space. Again, you can see a small image. You can see the bungalow there created with a veranda in front, bringing a European style, but also making it a little bit adjustable to the sort of Indian landscape. But in the front are tea tea leaves being grown, and you can see all the different people, mainly women, who then collected the tea leaves. And you can see a British man in a solar topi up there in front, instructing them how to do it. So you had this rustic English village model, unlike the cantonments and bungalows in the plains in a place like Bangalore, also being brought to the hill station to make it even more European. And the labor issue was, of course, a major thing that one can talk about. So part of the postcard revolution and that sudden rise of the postcard was that there were a lot of artistic magazines around postcard publishing in the late 1890s and so forth in Austria and Germany, in the early 1900s in Britain. This is the British magazine, which was around in the early 1900s, 1903, 1904, called The Picture Postcard. And the editor, E.W. Richardson, wrote about how this card, which he actually lifted out, this is by Johnston and Hoffman, a Calcutta publisher. And you can see the coolie, the laborer who collected tea. And next to him on his right is a tea basket where the tea leaves were put into. And he's sitting on a box where once the tea was dried, it was then shipped to Calcutta from where it was shipped to Europe. But Richardson in this issue made a point, and I'm quoting, where he was hoping that the British could offer, quote, the cream of continental, which is European postcards. And if we want to reach the masses to make postcard collecting and using as popular as it is on the European continent, we must keep the popular price of 1 penny. So from the very beginning, there was this interest in bringing the prices down, just as we have with digital mediums today, to make it as accessible to as many people as possible. And the name of this gentleman here is Bhutia, which was, as Claire Harris, who has a great book on photography in Tibet and the area, is an opaque ethnic sort of category. And Darjeeling was very much, as she says, quote, a contact zone where Europeans occupied the same space as long-established Himalayan communities, if in a condition of highly unequal power relations. So postcards were part of this sort of mediation between the colonists and the local people. This is a woman who also picked tea. You can see exactly the same sort of basket next to her. And you can see very quickly the way there was a focus on making the image as big as possible within the constraint of 3.75 by 5.5 inches, which was sort of the sort of standard for postcards at that time. And you can see the first image. She's smaller, there's more space in the front. Once you are allowed to write on the back, the image could take over the whole front of the postcard. And I'll call your attention to the stamps in the front, which are quarter Anna stamped over it. And I think it's the English King George V. There was a performative art to sending a postcard. You try to compose it and give it some color and give it some life and use stamps as a way of enhancing and customizing the postcard. And we'll get into some of that, what these stamps might have meant later on. This is a very popular postcard, again by Johnston and Hoffman, a group of 3 Bhutia women. Images of people circulated like never before, and the people were obviously a big draw, and many of the postcards of India at the time were of the people, of course, because they were something unusual and different. And of course, there was an unequal power relationship, but I think we should pay attention to the agency of the people involved as well. All the 3 women are looking straight back at the camera here, and although they've been hired, they're probably sitting in the studio and so forth, they're also asserting their own individuality in a certain way. And I think we need to note that even though these were colonial subjects, they also had, their own agency and their own power, and they did sort of push back in different ways in different places. And this became even more pronounced as Indian photographers slowly took over. So at the very beginning, it was mainly Europeans, continental Europeans, and then more British. But over time, of course, as we shall see, Indian photographers became the major publishers of postcards throughout the subcontinent. These are 2 more postcards. On the left is a hunter. Again, the stamp is there. You can see the postmark right there. Postcards were not only driven by sending postcards to your friends and relatives and people back home. They're also a big part of it was collectors. So a lot of the postcards that we have today were actually bought by collectors, and they would have collecting magazines. They would say, I'm willing to pay, 1 franc, whatever it might be, a D-mark, for a postcard from India, and they would like it to be canceled in the front. And they would like the cancellation from the place, in this place, Calcutta, shown in the front with a stamp. So the collectors actually are the people that we can thank for having saved so many of these postcards for us. And on the right, you'll see a milkman, and there's a picture of, maybe it's a church in England, and milk was a part of the sort of British sense of, we will need to have clean milk for our kids, and all of that kind of stuff. So a milkman was who brought around milk, and hopefully it was not adulterated, was somebody who was also celebrated. Postcards were a fashionable thing, so we very quickly changed the styles and types of postcards, because just like as with clothes and fashion today, you wanted different and the most new kind of postcard. So on the, you had these little frames come. This is Morley Dhar and Company. I think this is it was an Ambala-based photographer. On the left, you have a Tibetan Lama. On the right, you have a Nepalese woman. Again, you see the stamp put down there in a certain way. Now, there was, and some people say this is, not quite accurate, but there was actually a language of stamps, that you put a certain colored stamp in a certain position on the front of a postcard, and you were sending a message to someone. So a red stamp with the head up in this form would mean write soon. And if you turned it upside down, it might mean I love you, or you haven't written me for a long time. And there was a whole secret language, and you actually had postcards which showed the different representations of different stamps and how they could be put on the front of a postcard to let people know what other message was being communicated through the postcard. And remember, postcards were also revolutionary in the sense that they were a completely open medium. They were not tucked in an envelope, and anybody could read a postcard through the entire message. And then, I mean, the other thing is, as Claire Harris points out, these postcards also show the way that Tibetanness or difference, or whoever the people were, could be staged photographically for British consumption. So, this idea of making postcards a kind of theatrical representation of what the people were like in a different region was very much a part of the art form. There are also many different ways and styles of postcards that were developed. This is by D. Macropolo and Company. This was a big tobacco company that had branches in Bombay and Calcutta at the time. And in this case, you had a collar type postcard, which was printed in black and white. And then, most likely in India, it was hand stenciled with some color. So you'll see the green patch on the left. You'll see a little bit of brown and yellow and a blue sky. So there was this other sense of using handwork. This was often done by women, maybe, especially in Europe, but done by women. We're not so sure who did it at studios in India, but you had a stencil put over the postcard, and then people would add in a little bit of color to it. And being a tobacco company, and people would come from tobacco, it was easy to then sell a postcard there. And Macropolo was another major publisher of postcards in the entire subcontinent. This is another very popular Darjeeling view, where Sunday bazaar, where they called lepchas and bhutias, could be observed and their goods sold. So they would all come on Sunday in Darjeeling, sell their goods, display themselves, be photographed, and that Sunday market was a very popular theme of postcards. You had very interesting different styles develop as well. And S&D Singh and Company in Darjeeling are actually one of my favorite publishers. These are very hard to find postcards. They are real photographic postcards. On the right, you see two Nepali girls. It's a very nice photograph, and the rest of the environment is all sort of whited out, so you can really focus on the two people. On the left, you have a man, a sort of a fakir type, but then hand stenciled, hand painted in color as well. So you have a very unique artistic blend here of the real photograph to which color is added. And my favorite of all of their postcards is this sunrise from Tiger Hill, where actually in black and white, it's not that great. But the moment this hand color has been added, it looks almost psychedelic in its representation. So, and this is from about 1920, 1930. So in a very small, set of decades, you had a quick evolution of the postcard. You had many different types. You had many artistic styles coming up. And for me, and one of the reasons that I'm a collector and enjoy postcards is so much, is because you can see how these different publishers and printers and artists brought their own craft to these postcards and made something different out of them. So let's turn to Shimla for a second, which was actually the most important hill station, many hundreds of miles away from Darjeeling. Hill stations were a place where the British could, quote, stretch their psychic limbs in an environment that was more familiar to them than the rest of India. And nowhere was this more true than in Shimla, which became the capital of the Raj. Kipling wrote some of his finest stories set here, and it was connected by rail only in 1903. But even 2 decades before that, from Calcutta, the entire Viceroy's cabinet and everything would move up here. And this is the place where actually much between the 1880s and maybe around, through World War I, most of the British spent most of their time. And Shimla itself became shorthand for government, which is where, India was ruled from. And it was from these, quote, Olympian heights that the Viceroy and so forth made many of the major decisions. This is by a postcard, an very early postcard of Shimla from by Fred Bremner and Company. Bremner was a photographer who came down to Karachi and then went to Balochistan, Lahore, made his way up to Shimla, where he had a studio by the early 1900s as well. And I think it's worth looking at this image for a second and realizing that the word hill station is a little bit manipulative, because actually these hill stations were hugging a very delicate they were in a very delicate situation on the side of a hill, and they could easily be blown off or taken down. It was a tenuous position that they were in. And on this precipice at the very top, we'll see clearer in some other images, is a church, and from there on the bazaar stretched down. And by this time, early 1900s, the British were spending twice as much time, the government here, as they did in Calcutta. This is one of the most beloved places for the British in Shimla. It's called Annandale. And I draw your attention to the trees for a moment, because one of the beauties of the collotype is that it's actually a much better printing mechanism and means than the halftone, because you can see the richness, almost as in a photograph, of all of these trees, the thick blacks. It's actually a very beautiful image. So this was a slice that the British kind of lopped off and made into sort of their playground. They played polo here, and I'm just going to quote from Edward Buck, whose book Shimla Past and Present, which you can get free from archive.org, by the way. It's from 1904. He was the major chronicler of Shimla. He wrote, quote, "There is possibly no name connected with Shimla, which to thousands of Anglo-Indians, past and present, can revive more memories of a pleasant nature than that of Annandale." This small patch of tableland, about a quarter-mile in diameter, was a favorite picnic playground for the elite. Later, they were used for polo and so forth. The land was, I think, bought from some Maharajas. The name Annandale came from an early resident up there, Major Kennedy, who was apparently in love with a woman called Anna back in England or Scotland, and tried to call it Annadale, but it quickly became corrupted to Annandale. And this became sort of the place where the British sort of had a lot of their memories congealed around. Again, this was a postcard by Johnston and Hoffman in Calcutta. And here you can, I also wanted to sort of draw your attention to two views. This is the view from the Grand Hotel in Shimla, which we'll see in a moment. On the left is Bremner's view. Again, there's space for writing a message and so forth on the left. And on the right is a Tuck and Company postcard. So although the British were late to coming to printing the postcards, it was actually Raphael Tuck and Company that became the biggest publisher of postcards of India, and probably the biggest publisher around the world. It was founded in the late 19th century as a printer in London by a Jewish businessman from Eastern Europe. And Tux developed a style of printing colored postcards using halftones. And they claimed that all their postcards came from paintings, but they actually were photographs that were then made to look a little bit like paintings and then printed at their presses in London and then sent around the world. I think they published around 1,000 different postcards of India, maybe 500 or so in color, but they became the major publisher of India postcards, I would say, until about the 1930s or 1940s. And just look at how people are used, as in earlier albumin photographs, as a measure of size. They're standing there in very sort of docile form to show you how big the trees were, and just sort of added as a touch of sort of interest in the landscape. And this also represented the sort of transformation from the black and white collotype or the hand stenciled to the colored printed postcard. This is a view of Shimla looking sort of down, and on the left you'll see some of the, there's a post office and sort of bazaar scenes. There's the church, which is the Anglican church, was always the center of these hill stations. The amount of wood that was consumed in a place like Shimla in the early years when they built, there were about 250,000 cubic feet of timber per year to build all these structures. And even once much of the hill station was complete, it was more like 85 to 90,000 cubic feet of timber all the time. So they actually had to use reforestation very quickly. And in places like Darjeeling and even Murree and Ooty and other places, they so quickly took down all the trees that they had to import different species from Australia or even Japan, I think in the case of Ooty, to replenish the forests because there was so much sort of ecological damage being done. I also want to draw your attention to the Himalayan Swiss Gothic style that you can see on the post office in the left, and a unique style within these hill stations was being developed, and you can see that most clearly in this first hospital that was built in Shimla called the Ripon Hospital. And I want to just describe to you, by the way, Danes describes this Himalayan Swiss Gothic hybrid style. Quote, "It was distinguished by multi-storied structures with chimneys thrusting up from steep roof lines, numerous gables and terraces cutting against the vertical grain, and ornately carved fretwork framing the eaves, windows, and doors. The result looked like a cross between a Victorian garden villa and a Swiss chalet." So part of the British project here, and postcards were, let's say one of the instruments, were to make it look as much like home as possible, but then make some accommodations for the local style and environment, using woods, wanting the veranda so you could sit outside and enjoy the view, and so forth. So there was this hybrid form that developed. And you can see this most clearly in the Viceregal Lodge up here, which is where the Viceroy spent his time, which today, by the way, is the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies up in Shimla. And you can sort of see on the left that style sort of developed. These are both Tux postcards, and at the bottom is the gardens of the Viceroy's house. And if you look at the bottom one, you'll see the back at the very top of the postcard of exactly the same sort of mansion. And gardening and sort of taking over space and reconstructing it in a form that made sense, as the English garden was also part of making this space your own. So this is, these postcards, by the way, were popular through the 1930s and 40s, so they had a very long life. This is probably, this is the Grand Hotel, which we had seen the views from before. And this is it's not only a very beautiful postcard, but it sort of shows you have the, British man and woman up front. They're going to be taken around in the carriage, but you see that sort of Swiss Gothic style, the gables. And again, this was a hand-tinted postcard. So it's part of the different kinds of styles that evolved and were all available at the same time. And then, you had these gold-rimmed postcards as well. So you would have many different kinds of fads that developed that different people wanted for different reasons. And the club, by the way, was another center of British life in those days. And Indians were often, of course, excluded from these clubs. Even lower class British people would often be excluded. And even if a Maharaja wanted to come, it could sometimes create a big scandal and issue. You also had artists develop their own little styles. This William Poole was a painter who lived in Shimla, actually, and then developed these beautiful paintings, painted postcards. And you can see the people at the very top one in Jacko in Shimla were just, hardly like flowers. So people had been subdued. Then you have the beautiful mists coming up, which I remember from Murray. The mists coming up from the Punjab plains are gorgeous, especially in summer. And in the right, you can see the bazaar looking up. And the bazaar, and I'll show you in Murray in a second, had a very clear hierarchy to it. These were probably one of the biggest publishers by the 1910s or 1920s was H.A. Mirza and Company in Delhi. And you can sort of see the slight shift towards modernism. On the left was a new hospital that was constructed, Walker Hospital. You have this sense of sort of looking off into the future. On the bottom right is what they called Luckar Bazaar, where monkeys would often come down and flood the bazaar and drive the people out, and people would have to close the stores. But you see, these were both printed in Germany. And I should say that Germany by this time, by the 1910s or 1920s, probably published 80 or 70% of all the postcards in the world. This was Stengel and Company, one of the biggest publishers. And you can see how a certain color combination to make everything look like a sunset, and sort of this beautiful orange and yellow and blue, and a few clouds up in the, in the sky that were added to say what would originally have been a photograph, was just part of the style that was developed. This is another Mirza shot. This is the temple up here. And there's an interesting story that Buck tells about how the son of a French photographer, Charles de Rousset, came up here and decided to become a fakir himself. And he left the Bishop Cotton School at the age of 17, came and settled up here, got along very well with the monkeys. He was accepted by the other fakirs in the area. He became known as the leopard fakir in Shimla and wandered around the bazaar in fakir dress, wore this big headdress. He retired to another temple later on. He apparently was interviewed by somebody much later in life. He had forgotten his French and lived a very idle, happy, and contented life without any anxiety about the morrow, according to an interviewer in the 1892. So there were some British people who actually came here and stayed and loved it and built their own relationship to the place. Again, some of the postcards show the incredible backbreaking labor that was required here. And I remember as a kid in Murray seeing people whose backs were permanently hunched from carrying stuff and wood and so forth. And this is a Born and Shepherd, a postcard from Shimla. They also had a studio up there of a man carrying this much weight. So we should pay attention to the backbreaking work here. Then, of course, the people were a focus of the British interest. These are Paharis, as they call them. Paharis hardly require to be ruled, quote, which is what a Times correspondent wrote at that time. They felt that people were very, docile and so forth, although Garhwalis, which were, soldiers, and Gurkhas were actually not that far away either. So people were then represented and could be reconfigured as fighters or docile or ever sit in any different way. And Kipling wrote about these people, and Lisbeth had a Greek face, and all these short stories were written about these people in different ways. The other thing to be noted about hill stations were they were really the nurseries of the colonists, because this was the one place where there were probably as many women as men, and British people who lived in the plains would send their families, their wives up there. They were known as grass widows. Their husbands were in the plains, and they could have fun up here in the hills, which the postcard on the left speaks to in some way. The postcard on the right, I won't say more about. It's a man jumping into a pool with a bunch of other men called a mountain nymph. This is my favorite postcard of Shimla. This is a sort of abstract snowy scene. I think it's a house covered in snow and icicles because of the ladder, but I'm not sure. But again, it's these unusual postcards that I quite like. Let's turn to Murray now, which is what I know best. That is way up in Pakistan. That is very near Islamabad and Rawalpindi, about a 1-hour drive from there. This was set up as a summer retreat for the Punjab government. But once Shimla became such an important place, the Punjab government put their summer capital in Shimla as well to be with the rest of the Raj. So here you can see in this image of the Murray Bazaar, and this is by my favorite photographer from the area, D. Balji, who made a lot of beautiful postcards. You can see the whole hierarchy of the Raj. At the very top and the left is the mall, which often was closed and just allowed for British people. And then you had the bazaar going down into ever poorer regions. And I think the Pakistani businessman Saeed Babar Ali tells an interesting story about his father being in Murray in 1906. And he was riding a horse, and a British man told him to get off the horse because he couldn't stand an Indian being higher than him in rank. So there was a lot of hierarchy and discrimination that was woven into the early years of these areas. I'm going to show you quickly some other Balji postcards, which they're all hand stenciled. He was a military photographer based in Peshawar and Murray, who made a number of really beautiful postcards of the different areas around the hill station. This is a soccer match. You can see the church up in the right background. This is a very interesting postcard. They just scored a goal. And if you look at the bottom left, you will see the ball just into the goal. And there's a sort of referee or policeman watching. People are putting their hands up. So to have captured this on a photograph and then printed it as a postcard was probably a really big deal. And sports were a big part of the British attraction to these places. This is a very interesting postcard by Tej Ban in D.I. Khan, who was a photographer there. This little boy fell down this hill for a few hundred feet in the evening and then was rescued in the morning and turned out still to be alive. And it was interesting because I don't know how you could survive that long there, because there are a lot of wild animals and so forth in those days. But it was such a celebratory event. They made a real photo postcard around this and captured the other photograph of the boy up. This is the convent of Jesus and Mary up in Murray, which is still there and still actually used very much. A lot of Pathan girls study here and learn English and then go back to Peshawar or Pindi. Education was one of the drivers of growth in all hill stations, Shimla, Darjeeling, and other places as well. There were schools and colleges set up. Lawrence College, Lawrence Asylum, there was one in Murray. I think there was one in, there were across India as well. So there were a lot of schools set up here, and a lot of teachers came here, and they're still used as educational institutions. I've interviewed sisters up here at different points, and there were still sisters from Europe who taught here in their 80s and 90s, in the 70s and 80s. This is a story of an image of a British, army sort of general, I think, walking through, this is Murray Cantonment. I should say that the British did a terrible job of running military campaigns from the hill stations. From Shimla, they managed catastrophic wars in Afghanistan, the First and Second Afghan War. The worst was World War I in Mesopotamia, where thousands of Indian troops and many British troops as were killed and taken prisoner fighting the Turks in around Baghdad. And then the whole war responsibility for World War I was taken away from the British government in India and shifted to London. And then they managed to, reconquer Iraq and so forth. So they did a very bad job of running, military stuff from the hill stations. The other big British thing that they loved to do in hill stations was put on plays. There were tons of plays put on in Shimla. They're written around in the press all the time. I've not found any postcard. This is a postcard with the Murray Brewery Cup, which was given to some, I don't know what play this was, but this is a bunch of British people who played in a play. You can sort of see them sort of in costume. There are two little Indian boys in the front, but there was a really big theatrical scene. And this is part of what the British enjoyed doing when they were up in hill stations, playing in these different sort of dramatic theatrical productions. This was the brewery in Murray. Many hill stations had breweries. This is now today a very beautiful ruin, but the Murray Brewery Company is still a very big company, and they actually have breweries in other areas of what is now Pakistan as well. But this was built in the 1860s, and you can see the man who ran the brewery was right there in front. And this is the main church at Shimla, which is where I wandered in one day, sort of accidentally, many years ago, and stumbled upon the story of John Burke, who was a photographer there, and managed to sort of wrote my first book about him. But I wanted to sort of draw your attention to the camera on the bottom right. You can see the camera on the tripod. I think this is a Balji a postcard because he got into real photographic postcards later on, and this looks like his imprint on the left. But what's interesting is that the photographer was self-conscious enough to say something about the way that they were photographing by showing a camera in the foreground. So it's these kinds of little bits of artistry that I find very sort of interesting. And as in most hill stations, this was the Anglican, the Protestant church, which was the most beautiful and nicest church. There are a bunch of Catholic churches in other parts of Murray, and they're much more sparse. They were for much sort of lesser, less wealthy population, the army soldiers, the Irish soldiers, and other people who then served, and there were cantonments up here as well. So you had a hierarchy, a caste system among the British as well, where the Protestants were on top and the Catholics typically were sort of below them. There was a big transformation of hill stations. So I should just say that after World War I, it became much easier for the British to send their families back to England. Transportation had gotten much better. It was much less expensive to do the travel and so forth. So hill stations were actually taken over by Indians. And you had Maharajas and wealthier people build their own houses, rent their own houses. And in this sort of photographic postcard, real photo postcard, you sort of have the sense of an Indian coming in with his bag, the blurry man in the front, sort of taking over the hill station. And although there are a few British people scattered in the background, there's even a lady in the sort of middle of the image. There was this big shift in the 20s and 30s where the local people actually took over the hill stations, took over the villas, built their own houses there, and have become a sort of the major residents. And there was a lot of protests around this by the British to begin with. They didn't like it very much, and they tried to stop Maharajas and so forth from buying houses, but it didn't really work. And in the long run, of course, the hill stations have been completely taken over by the local population. This next postcard is a very interesting and very rare postcard. It's a color postcard. It's from the early 1940s. I don't know exactly how it was made and how it was tinted, but by this time in the interwar years, they had very much faded, and Murray faded especially. Murray got a new lease of life when Pakistan's capital was moved to Islamabad in the 60s, and it became a very popular place. And today it's completely overrun by people coming up from Lahore and Rawalpindi and other places. So there's tons of local people there, and I'm sure it's a very similar situation in Shimla and Darjeeling as well. So it actually was taken back. And they're flourishing, even if overcrowded. And of course, ecologically, it's very difficult to get water up there and fuel, and it's becoming quite a problem. Still have spectacular views, though. I wanted to just do a postscript and just end with a single postcard of Ooty, which is another hill station way in the south. And in this one postcard from about 1902, 1903 by Wiele and Klein, who was a Chennai-based German photographer again, you can sort of see the whole story of the hill station. You have the woman, a Toda girl here in the top left, looking straight at the camera, frank stare, which is what the sort of British like. On the right, again, the color type shows how beautifully you can represent the trees, but the landscape of Ooty was transformed by the British because there was a creek running through and they dammed it up to make a lake. Then they brought a bunch of trees from different places to help plant it more. So the trees are actually an Australian species, many of the trees in the Ooty area. So the British were involved in this transformation of the landscape to suit their own ideal of what something would look like and be beautiful and sublime. So nothing is simple with hill stations. They were both pristine and constructed. They were both victims and beneficiaries of European reality transposed. They transfigured the landscape, but they were hybrid places. And they now are a part of a vibrant sort of Indian, Pakistani, even Sri Lankan sort of reality. Foreigners may haunt them, but they are also very much indigenous places today. So that's it. If you are into further reading, I recommend Magic Mountains by Dane Kennedy, which really goes through the whole history of the hill stations. Claire Harris has a wonderful book on photography in Tibet that covers Darjeeling very much as well. And then my book on postcards in India is Paper Jewels, and down there are my Instagram handles and so forth. But I'm always happy to learn more and discover more about postcards, and I continue to collect them. And I think there are many more stories to be told about these little humble objects. With that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Omar, for that fascinating presentation. We have two questions from the audience at the moment,
Sure.
and maybe I'll dive right into it. So Karishma Jora wants to ask if you have traveled to any of these places, which you did briefly mention in your talk. And she also wonders if you like any of the postcards from now, from the contemporary times, or do you like the ones from back in the 1900s?
So I've been to Murray a lot. I have not been to I've been to Uti as well, which I really like. I have not been to Shimla or Darjeeling, so I've been to some of the places and would very much look forward to going to more of the places. I am not, unfortunately, I live in the past when it comes to postcards. So I'm not up to date on the postcards today from these locations. Postcards are not as popular as they were in those times, and you still can go to Murray and find postcards in some places, but nowhere near the number of postcards that I even remember, as a kid when I would go up there, in the 70s and 80s and even early 90s. So postcards have become much less, physical postcards have become much less popular than they are today, but they're change. I mean, what has changed is that people are putting posts on Instagram. People are sharing stuff on WhatsApp or Facebook. So you're doing posts, you're making posts, which comes from the word postcard, but they're digital, not as much as the postcards today. But no, if there are beautiful postcards made today from these places, I would love to know more about them, and perhaps I should look at them more closely, but I'm sorry, I can't say more about them.
Thank you. We also have Ruth, who is asking if you could please repeat the name of the book, which you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and also quoted from later on.
So Dane Kennedy, The Magic Mountains, is one of the books that I quoted from. And then Tibetan Photography in Tibet by Claire Harris is another book that sort of focuses on Darjeeling and sort of the Tibetan area and postcards there. And then Kennedy's book is about sort of the history of hill stations. And there are a number of other books on hill stations as well, also by different Indian writers. So there's a wide variety. And then if you like to go to archive.org, Shimla Past and Present, you can download by 1906. So that's another good book. So yeah, there are books available.
Great. Thanks for sharing that again. Karishma has another question. She would like to know if you are aware of post-crossing.
I am, where people are sending postcards to each other, I think today, from different places. And yes, and I think I've sometimes a long time ago maybe used the site if that's the correct site. Yes. So there is, I would say, there is an attempt to revive something of the ancient, use of sending postcards, physical postcards from one place to another, to a loved one or something else. But let me add one thing about this. You remind me of something I did not say in my sort of talk. I forgot, which is that postcard collecting and sending was very much a woman's art. And most of the postcards sent from India back to Europe, I think by a ratio of 2 or 3 to 1, were sent to women. So, and women were the major collectors of postcards, and they put postcards in albums. And we see this not only around Indian postcards, we see this around European postcards that were sent, because women kind of controlled the parlor, and many people would have albums, and women would then assemble the postcards, put them in albums, and then show them to visitors when they came. And you can look at the postcards that were addressed to different people, and they were sent like a British person might be serving, or a European, and they would send something to their wife or daughter or girlfriend, whatever it might be, back in Europe, and then they would put those postcards in albums. So it was one of the first mediums that was really taken over by women. And even today, when you buy old albums, they're often inscribed by in the name of women, collected by them.
Great. Wonderful. An anonymous attendee wants to know, how do you think the imagery on the postcards from the hills differ to the ones from the larger cities? Is there a difference?
Yes, absolutely. Because, you're constrained in a way by showing what is there. So the hill station postcards much more tried to focus on the European elements in the hill stations. But then they also showed the people. And I would say the similarity is that there was a lot of focus on people, both in the hill stations and in, the urban centers and cantonments and so forth, because the people were still a fascinating thing because they look different from the people that most Europeans were used to. I would say that And you saw in the Sing sort of images where they were hand tinted. I would say the postcards in the hill stations could veer a little bit more towards fantasy and a sense of unreality and a space that was just different and vastly more open to artistry maybe. And you saw some even the Shimla shot with the icicles and so forth. So there was a little bit more of that freedom to try anything and do something abstract, in my estimation, around hill station postcards.
Mhm. Yes, in continuation, Anahita asks, is it possible to gain some understanding of European colonial perception of Indian Pahari tribes? And have you observed any patterns in regard to popularity of certain types of postcards or any other factors in your study?
Good question. I mean, I think that I think you can learn more about the perceptions of Paharis in fiction, like Kipling's, and probably in writing than you can from postcards, because I don't know that many postcards of Paharis in particular. There are probably a limited number, but maybe there are many more out there that I don't know about. Yeah, but I do think the perceptions changed a little bit, and they were different of the people up in the sort of hill station area, and that sense of looking straight at you, being more amenable, being nicer, more peaceful, more easy to deal with was definitely something that you see in the British writing, and you might say to some extent in the postcards as well, because there were so many different ethnic groups and people looked so different up in a place like Darjeeling compared to, say, the rest of Bengal, that I think that struck the British as people. And the Todas in Uti as well were really picked up by postcard sort of enthusiasts. So I think that sense of having these unique and different looking people were something that appealed to the postcard publishers and printers and their customers, because ultimately you were dealing with a market there and you wanted to show the variety of kinds of people that were out there.
Mhm. Great, thank you. Guess I was also curious about, okay, there's another question
Okay.
that asks, could Omar, if possible, talk a little more about the transplantation, adoption, adaptation, and evolution of the Swiss Gothic style of architecture in hill stations in India?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on that. And I think Dane Kennedy's book is there. And there's not been that much great research, like the way it's like, for instance, Thomas Metcalf has done about, architecture in South Bombay, for example, and that whole style of the neoclassical coming into India. And that's more in the cantonments. I don't know of some great stuff other than Kennedy's that's been written about that style. But I think basically what happened was the British got to the hill stations. They tried to quickly make buildings that looked as familiar to them as possible, and they named the buildings Snowdon, Snow Cottage, every possible English type name was attached to the building and the very first cottages that they made up in Murray. But then they had to adjust what they built to deal with the conditions up there. You had heavy snow coming in the winter. You would like to sit in a veranda in the summer. So that's how you had this hybrid style develop, which both tried to remind them of Europe, but was also adapted to the situation in India, which was maybe much colder, much higher, maybe warmer in the summer, all these mists coming up. So there were a lot of different features. And a place like Murray, for example, is incredibly damp, even in the buildings today. So you have to make these adjustments. And I think that's probably on an abstract level what drove the development of style. But I would say to the person who asked the question, this is a great thing to research. I mean, I think there are a lot of areas where a lot more work could be done. And it would also be interesting to sort of look at the different styles that developed in different hill stations, because there are different elevations. Uti is in a very different place. Even Bangalore, in a way, was, quote, a hill station of sorts at the time, and Darjeeling and Shimla. So it would be something that I think is good for further research. Not that I necessarily will do it, but maybe somebody else.
Yeah, wonderful. Um, I was also wondering, in your presentation, you spoke about the environmental damage that was caused to a lot of these hill stations where there was deforestation and there was also the transformation of the landscape itself. How do you learn about these historical facts? Are these included in the messages themselves that are, communicated within these postcards, or do you refer to different sources? What kind of sources are these?
Great question.
Yeah, that's
It was not, yeah, very good question. It's not really, I cannot say that the postcards themselves really talk about that, because most of the postcards messages is, I wish you were here, I'm missing you, whatever. It's something sort of like that. Uh, it is in the documentation and the books and the newspapers written about it. So like you can see from the very start, Edward Buck's book on Shimla, past and present from 1906, even he talks about all the different kinds of trees that were in Shimla, the different elevations, what happened, how they were deforested. We had to bring them back. We had to replant them. You can see in the local ordinances in places like Murray and Darjeeling as well, that quickly rules were being passed because people were cutting down trees for firewood because it was so cold. And then you had to get a permit to cut down a tree, or you were penalized, or you had to pay. So you can actually see a lot from the very beginning, because you can look at shots, albumin photographs from the 1860s, where whole hillsides, like at Kashmir Point in Murray, were completely deforested to build the bungalows, and they looked like they're terrible. So then you would have the ordinances passed saying that you're not allowed to cut down trees. You actually have to plant trees if you're an owner, and people would then plant up trees. So today, it's a beautiful pine forest in the area, and you had the same thing happen in different places. So I would say it's interesting that from the very beginning, there was an attention paid to reforesting, because the moment they saw that the forests came down, erosion would happen, the buildings themselves could be damaged. So you had, because the situation was so stark and the damage was so great so quickly, people were made aware of what they were doing, and they started putting into place practices that help preserve the landscape. That said, I'm not so sure what's the situation is in Shimla and Darjeeling, but I know in Murray there are tremendous water shortages, there are power shortages. They've built this beautiful highway so you can get up there. What used to be an hour and a half trip is now like 40 minutes on a 2-lane highway. But so many more people come, and that puts so much more pressure on the food and infrastructure system that it's actually doing a lot of damage. And I think that municipalities and governments need to become much more aware of what's happening, or the hill stations will not be that nice places to visit for long.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is very relevant to what's happening in India even now. A lot of hill stations are seeing so many tourists trying to visit these places, and it's had very detrimental effects on the environment. So that's a trend, I guess, that's unfortunately continuing to this day.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with that, Omar, we come to the end of today's session. Thank you so much for doing this presentation for us and for bringing together a different perspective on the history of hill stations through postcards. Thank you, and I'd also like to thank our audiences for all their questions and for joining us today.
Great.
Yes, thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Also, one last thank you to also our ISL interpreters for today, to Preeti and Saurabh. And for those of you who are joining us from Bangalore, we would like to invite you all to please come to MAP and see the exhibition Hello and Goodbye, Postcards from the Early 20th Century, which is on view at the museum till the 18th of August. A little bit about the exhibition. Hello and Goodbye explores tangents of lived experiences and the Western perception of undivided India through about 80 postcards, delving into the dynamics between print culture, colonial propaganda, and the question of identity. These objects offer a glimpse into life in the early 20th century, and postcards also enable us to analyze trends in imagery, types of messages conveyed, and the demographics of those who wrote these postcards, as we also learned a lot about this in today's presentation from Omar. So if you visit the exhibition, you can learn a bit more about this. And with that, we come to an end. Thank you once again, Omar, for joining us today. And thank you to everyone who attended. Have a good evening.